I would now like to welcome Judge Neligan, who has recently retired after 35 years in service, to explain the sentencing criteria involved in knife crime.
Dawn actually inflated my years of service. If I'd done 35, I would have got double the pension I'm getting. In fact, I only did. It's been 18 years, although I had 53 years in legal practice in one shape, form or another. Now, in recent years, particularly since the murder of Stephen Lawrence, the law has responded to the increasing public concern about knife crime due to the alarming escalation of incidents of violence where knives or other bladed articles have been used. Now, as you will all appreciate, knife crime has a devastating effect on individuals, families, and indeed communities. And the lack of understanding that some people, in particular, young people, have of the dangers of carrying and using a knife is of real concern, particularly amongst the gangland culture, where a knife is used in a fight, even in one-to-one or two-against-one violence, you cannot say that a knife plunged into the body will not pierce a vital organ, resulting in death, if not instantaneously, shortly afterwards. If you carry a knife and use it, you can't measure how far the knife is going to go in. It goes in, and frequently the result is fatal. So, if a knife is used, it must be a matter of pure chance that death will not be the ultimate result. So then, certainly 2 lives, possibly more, will be forever ruined. Certainly the victim, but also the offender, who will be serving a life sentence of imprisonment, but also the offenders' families as well, and certainly the victims' families will suffer. So the courts must respond to send out a loud and clear message that for people who carry, and worse still, use knives, a custodial sentence will be inevitable. Magistrates have been issued with sentencing guidelines. No Crown Court guidelines at present exist for carrying knives or other offensive weapons in public, although, of course, it will be an aggravating feature to a more serious offence, and depending upon the circumstances, a consecutive sentence for carrying a knife or weapon will be imposed. Of course, there are a wide variety of circumstances in which the offence of being in possession of a bladed article in a public place may be committed. The presence or absence of mitigating and aggravating features will, of course, ultimately determine the appropriate sentence. For example, from simply carrying it in the street, say, for example, returning from a fishing trip, to being in possession of it on school premises or in a hospital, or other places where there may be elderly or vulnerable people. These are all circumstances which are relevant in deciding the length of the prison sentence. Being in possession of a knife at a large public gathering, where there may be a risk of public disorder, or on public transport, or in a public building, will be, of course, relevant considerations. The sentencing judge or magistrates we'll also have to consider these factors. Has the offender previous convictions? How old is he or she? Was he or she drunk or under the influence of drugs at the time? And has there been a plea of guilty? These are all factors which will go into the melting pot when deciding the sentence to be imposed. However, the message is that if the magistrates are following the guidelines which are issued to them for their assistance, then unless a case falls at the bottom of the scale of seriousness, a custodial sentence should be the outcome. And in my experience, the magistrates will, and certainly should, commit the offender for sentence by the Crown Court in all but a case right at the bottom end of the scale. The Crown Court will, and certainly should, follow the guidelines issued by the then Lord Chief Justice in a case in 2008 called Povey, P-O-V-E-Y, and others. Now, under existing law, those convicted of possession of a knife in a public place can be sentenced to up to 4 years imprisonment, although, of course, discretion is built into the process, so that the starting point for those who carry knives but who didn't use them or threaten with the knife will be lower than for those who use the knife or threaten with the knife. The Court of Appeal has very recently said that the sentencing judge in the Crown Court should be flexible when fixing the starting point for the sentence of imprisonment. Let me give you an example. If an offender aged over 18 has taken a knife with him and uses the knife to cause fatal injury, which results in a conviction for murder, the mandatory life sentence will carry a minimum term of 25 years as a starting point. And I emphasize the word starting point. It could well be more, it could be up to 30 years. Alternatively, if the offender picks up a knife, for example, in the kitchen, and then uses the knife, which causes the victim's death, the starting point for the minimum term will be then 15 years imprisonment. Where the offender is under 18, then of course the minimum term will be scaled down and the starting point will be 12 years. 12 years for a 17 or 18-year-old as the minimum for that offender is eligible for parole will take the young offender into the early 30s. Let me say a word about knife crime amongst young offenders, that is, people under 18. With a population of one young offender institution being of 440 prisoners, as many as 300 or more will have an element of knife use related to their crime, which sent them to the young offender institution. Offenders involved in gangs will have used blades to protect themselves, to intimidate their fellow gang members, or injure their rivals, sometimes fatally. For those involved in robbery, the knife adds an element of violence, different, let us say, from burglary. It demonstrates that the offenders are prepared to make their crime open by threatening their victims with weapons, and if necessary, have the confidence to use the knife or the weapon. For crimes involving sex, It's the knife or other blade which is used to threaten and so achieve power over the victim in order to make him, her or him, submit and so achieve the objective of committing the sexual offence. Amongst young offenders, the gang culture very often comes with them from the streets into custody, and with it the importance of the knife as part of that gang culture. For some within the prison system, the need to establish and maintain status, of course, remains a priority. Gang rivalry, punishment for non-payment of a debt, usually a drugs debt, conflict between two rival gangs, or punishment for, let us say, sex abuse, are all instances in which a knife or other bladed article may be used inside the prison. With the very strict systems in place for the use of any tools or utensils, the potential assailant has to be inventive. With all eating utensils being plastic, a metal knife is impossible to come by in the daily prison routine. However, in some workshops and classrooms, such as art and carpentry, restricted use of craft knives can lead to attempts to secrete a blade, and so strict checks within the prison have to be in place and made regularly. The more inventive amongst particularly young offenders will try to hide a razor blade after shaving and hope for careless checks by officers. Others may rip off a USB from a computer mouse and use the metal strips. Each, of course, would be suitable for melting into the back of a toothbrush, as two parallel strips of sharp metal would ensure a skin wound with parallel cuts that cannot be stitched, resulting in a more obvious scar, which would often stay for the remainder of the victim's life. The majority of the time, of course, the target is the face, where both the scar and the message it represents are there for all to see and remember. And an example of what I have just said is contained in this simple apparatus. It's a toothbrush. Within it, I put sellotape around it so nobody cuts themselves. And I'll hand it round so you can see an illustration of what I've just been talking about. It's an effective weapon. It can be easily concealed, and it's effective to do that to the face. But be careful. We'll have a look at it. That is a typical example of the toothbrush concealing a blade, and it often avoids detection. It's been made clear, as it possibly can be, by the courts, and in a conference like this, that young people who carry knives, let alone use them, are talking themselves into periods of time, very often very long periods of time, in custody, with the consequential ruination of their young lives and possibly into middle age. So the attitude of the courts is as clear as it possibly can be. But how is this message brought home to those who may be tempted to slip a knife into their pockets before going out for the evening? We need to raise awareness amongst young people, not just of the dangers of carrying and using knives, but of the consequences of doing so. And very often those are devastating consequences. And those consequences follow from becoming involved in the criminal justice system. But how can this be done? It seems to me that the most effective way is to be proactive rather than reactive. Early intervention should be the message taken away from a conference such as this one. Early intervention can best be achieved by going into schools to point out the dangers, to point out that there is nothing big or grand about being a tough gang member. The focus must, in my opinion, be upon schools to ensure that in some way education includes education about the dangers involved in carrying and using knives or weapons of any description. In my opinion, it should be part of the national curriculum to teach children about the dangers involved in knives and other weapons. And unless the problems and potential problems are addressed now and from a child's early age, then it may be too late in a potential victim or potential offender's life. If you lose the opportunities, then you risk the consequences of having to react to serious social problems and all that flow from those. So far as antisocial behaviour is concerned, of course that is all part and parcel of the culture that must be stamped upon at a child's very early age. Serious harassment or alarm can be caused to individuals, particularly elderly and vulnerable individuals. And where there is a conviction for serious harassment, then the starting point is 26 weeks custody. And the range will be up to 2 years custody. For young offenders, of course, the custody threshold usually will not be crossed unless the breach involved serious harassment, alarm, and distress to a vulnerable person or vulnerable group of people. But, of course, custody for a young person is and always should be the measure of last resort. But schools should be told that custody is appropriate where the harassment is severe and serious. So the message again is be proactive rather than reactive. If you have been, thank you for listening.